Good morning and welcome to this lecture on postmodernism. Now, what comes to your mind when we talk postmodernism? You have been introduced to a variety of theories so far, including structuralism, post-structuralism, semiotics, and others. So, my question is that what comes to your mind immediately the moment you hear the word postmodernism? Or is it post-modernism, or is it a single word, postmodernism? And are these two entities any different? What do you understand by that? Generally speaking, we understand postmodernist literature as something that embodies a case against realism. So, you see, many of these movements started as a sort of quote unquote revolution or rebellion or protest against realism, okay, the so called realistic mode of representations. And postmodernist literature embodies and encourages the dialogic as opposed to the monologic closure and debate in a variety of ways. These are the words that you should by now be familiar with. What is dialogic? Having more than or having at least two words or two exchanges, rather than monologic, which is a single voice. So, dialogic and monologic, and we also have multiplicity or plurality of discussion and also language and words. So, that is the idea that literature should function and representation should be more dialogic as opposed to monologic. Now, this anti-realist revolt is intended to function as a dissenting art form that challenges the unreliability of realism. So, this is important. Unreliability, realism, what we see is not always what we get. So, unreliability of realism, distrust of realism, which is a positive thing. Postmodernism is a term used to refer to changes, developments and tendencies which have taken or are taking place in various art forms such as literature, art, music, cinema, philosophy. We cannot exactly pinpoint the exact period of its commencement, but generally it is regarded as the late 40s and the 50s, and reached its peak during the 60s and 70s. Disarticulation and fracture are the ways postmodernists take to go beyond modernism. Postmodernists are also very skeptical of anything that is so called, that is termed as rational, something which the modernists are insistent upon. So, this is a point of departure. Now, a couple of definitions. For example, Linda Hutchin, and she famously asserts that postmodernism manifests itself in many fields of cultural endeavor, including architecture, literature, photography, film, painting, video, dance, music and elsewhere. In general terms, it takes the form of self-conscious, self-contradictory and self-undermining statement. A major theorist of postmodernism is the French critic Jean-François Lyotard, who wrote the influential book The Postmodern Condition, published in 1979, and he gives us the key term called which is popularly known as the meta-narrative. Meta-narrative indicates the overarching mythic narratives which individuals and societies tell in order to situate their particular time and place within the context of a larger society, thereby giving it a deeper significance. A meta-narrative locates a current situation within a larger narrative structure. These narratives are contained in or implied by major philosophers such as Kant, Hegel, Marx. We have been doing these thinkers during this course, and the idea is that these narratives are a sort of meta narratives, and to explain it further, the two main narratives Lyotard attacks are Christian redemption to Marxist utopia and the triumph of science. The postmodern condition is one in which there is an increasing distrust towards meta narratives. So, these are the important concepts that Lyotard attacks the concepts of Christian redemption and Marxist utopia. Lyotard argues that meta narratives are replaced by a proliferation of small stories, little stories, and the term he gives us is petty récits, okay, small stories as opposed to the grand stories as given to us by the concept of Marxist utopia and Christian redemption. So, these small stories draw attention to particular and not universal, and also they embody local events and personal individual experiences, but most importantly heterogeneity of ideas and other practices that may not fit within a larger universal meta-narrative. Another interesting concept in Lyotard is performativity. The idea of performativity is a quantifiable measure of efficiency which has become the dominant form of legitimation in postmodern society. Here information is power. The more information one has, the greater performativity one can achieve, and the increasing amount of information we gather through digital forms and databases, the question of the ownership and accessibility to them has become much more urgent. Now, coming to the major features of postmodernist ideas. So, apart from the concepts of performativity and meta-narrative, there are also certain key features. One is deconstruction that we have been talking about all along. The roots of deconstruction can be found, as you know, in the works of Saussure's semiotic theory of language. Deconstructionists hold the view that truth itself is always relative to different points of view. Therefore, deconstruction deny the final definition of anything or truth or the ultimate closure. The term was introduced in literary criticism by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, as you already know, and it points to the fact that the relationship of language to reality is not given or even reliable, since all language systems are inherently unreliable. Derrida also talks about the false logocentric dependence on language as the mirror of nature. He interrogates the Western tradition, which in his belief had falsely supposed that the relationship between language and world was well founded and reliable. For Derrida, difference is the groundlessness of language. The word actually he gives is difference. Okay, so it is the sphere of linguistic indeterminacy. This is important, and this indeterminacy and instability of language and its defiance of meaning, it all leads to deconstruction, which discloses the literary text as a dissemination of contradictions. So, literary text should be a mass, a bundle of contradictions, and not just giving you a universal truth. This is the idea, basic idea of deconstruction. We have also been familiar with the concept of the death of the author, Roland Barthes' idea that language and conventions of text become something to play with. Okay? Theorists such as Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault posit that author's intent should not be, authorial in intention. They need not be more trusted more than realism. Okay, attention to meanings intended by an author while reading a text is an example of the logocentric privileging of a particular set of meanings. We are also given another key term in postmodernism, that is the concept of defamiliarization. We have been doing this since we did our class on formalism especially. You may remember Russian formalist Viktor Shklovsky, who gave us the concept of defamiliarization or making something strange. The term suggests that the function of literature is to make the familiar unfamiliar and renew a perception that promotes a new awareness of the already familiar world. The core characteristics of postmodernist literature are undecidability, that suggests the impossibility of deciding between two or more competing interpretations. This involves celebration of multiplicity, heterogeneity and differences. We are also given a term called apocryphal history, where history is just a narrative and rather subordinate to its myths, metaphors and rather grand narratives. So, apocryphal history contradicts the official history by in one way, that is, it supplements the public record or it displaces the official history altogether. The idea is to demystify the traditional version of the past, revisit the past. So, we are also familiar with Chinese box structure of a narrative. Basically, it means distorted narratives which are subject to sudden shifts and transformations and have a kind of ambiguity about it. These suspend normal categories of time and space, and which is another important feature of postmodernism. Just the way mise en abîme is an important part of postmodernism, which involves the paradoxical reproduction within the fictional world of a fictional world itself. Its literal meaning is thrown into the abyss. So, fictional world of the fictional world, so fiction within fiction and multiplicity of fiction. So, there is plenty of ambiguity, and again the same idea, no definite closure and absolute indeterminacy, and as it opposes the very concept of logocentrism. Pastiche is yet another feature of postmodernist fiction and criticism, when it asks us to make distinction but not choices between high and low art. So, remember, this is different, this is important. You need to know the distinction, okay, but we need not basically choose what is high art and low art. So, blurring the boundary between the so called distinctions, the categories, high art, low art, popular culture, high culture, etc. And a good example of this would be Umberto Eco's novel The Name of the Rose, which brings together elements of high culture as well as popular detective culture, and all set in a monastery where a murder has been committed. So, in one of our earlier classes, especially when we were discussing semiotics, we have already discussed the novel. So, what is the purpose of mixing cultures? The idea is to create a sort of hybridity that challenges the traditional notion of uniformity in literature. For postmodernism, this word is very important, hybridization, which is a radical intertextuality, mixing genres and conventions, and genres become explicitly unstable, and basically mixing of high culture, low culture, and challenging the established norms of realism. So, hybridity also leads to a mixing up of, for example, mixing up a poem with a literal critical analysis and political thrillers. For example, we have John Fowles, The French Lieutenant's Woman, which uses history textbooks to tell us a love story, and then you also have A.S. Byatt's Possession, which mixes history and myth and literature and romance. So, carnival is yet another feature of postmodernism, given to us particularly by Mikhail Bakhtin, who uses the term carnival to suggest a defiance of any official closure or the authority of a single fixed sense of any kind. The term is also used to expose the violence, falsehood and inventions of official institutions, practices and prescriptions. During carnival time, official life comes to a temporary halt and an inversion of high and low takes place. This provides for a subversion of sensibility, a denial of closure. And then we have the idea of intertextuality, which is the shaping of texts and meanings by other texts. It can refer to an author's borrowing and transformation of a prior text or to a reader's referencing of one text in reading another. The term intertextuality has been particularly coined by post-structuralist scholar Julia Kristeva in 1966, where she channels Saussure's structural semiotics and Mikhail Bakhtin's dialogism. Simulation is another term associated with postmodernist criticism. If you remember, it was Plato who argued that painters, actors and dramatists, they produce representations or imitations of the real world. This way of thinking has given rise to a hierarchical opposition between the real and the copy. The postmodern, however, challenges such hierarchies and shows how the set of values associated with these oppositions can be questioned. Even nature in this postmodern reversal is subject to change, and the representation can be more real than the real itself. And another way of thinking about this phenomenon is to use Jean Baudrillard's term simulation, or also a word simulacrum, which means that where Baudrillard tries to tell us that we live in times which are saturated by images on the internet, television, advertising hoardings, magazines and where not. So, the real becomes unthinkable without the copy. In other words, simulation involves the disturbing idea that copy is not a copy of something real. The real cannot be divorced from the significance and effects of the copy. And this supports Baudrillard's notion of hyperreal, in which reality is created by technology. Now, here I would like to draw your attention to Baudrillard's concept of simulacra, which is taken from his work, The Precession of Simulacra. I will read you the quote. Hyperreality and simulation are deterrents of every principle and every objective. They turn against power the deterrent that it used so well for such a long time, because in the end, throughout its history, it was capital that first fed on the destructuration of every referential, of every human objective, that shattered every ideal distinction between true and false, good and evil, in order to establish a radical law of equivalence and exchange, the iron law of its power. Capital was the first to play at deterrence, abstraction, disconnection, deterritorialization, etc. And if it is the one that fostered reality, the reality principle, it was also the first to liquidate it by exterminating all use, value, all real equivalence of production and wealth, in the very sense we have of the unreality of the stakes and the omnipotence of manipulation. Well, today it is this same logic that is even more set against capital, and as soon as it wishes to combat this disastrous spiral by secreting a last glimmer of reality on which to establish a last glimmer of power. It does nothing but multiply the signs and accelerate the play of simulation. And then we have another concept that is we have been talking about, which is given to us by Lyotard, the notion of petty and grand narratives. And where grand narratives are notions, as I have already told you, Christianity, Marxism, Enlightenment, that attempt to provide a framework for everything. Such narratives follow a movement towards a time of equality and justice after the last judgment, the revolution, social scientific conquest of nature, etc., and then how all these things will end irrationality or injustice in society. That is the idea. Lyotard's position is that the contemporary worldview is governed by small stories, and Western discourse is characteristically unstable, fragmented, and does not appropriate a worldview at all, whereas little narratives present local explanations and are fragmentary and therefore important because they are non-totalizing. Thus, Lyotard argues that in the West, grand narratives have lost their efficacy, that their legitimacy and their powers of legitimation have been dispersed. Legitimation is now plural, local and contingent because there is no supreme authority which can sit in judgment, and by supreme authorities we mean Marx, Hegel, or even the powers, the unseen supernatural powers. Okay. So, we continue with our lecture in our next class. Thank you very much.